Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Is Israel trying to totally erase Palestine? Let's get to the bottom line. U.S. President Donald Trump may have just declared a historic breakthrough in war-torn Gaza, but the situation on the ground across the Palestinian territories points in the exact opposite direction. In the West Bank, the Israeli government has been caging in Palestinian villages and pushing people to a handful of cities, making most of the area a no-go zone for the millions of Palestinians who live there. Israeli settlers, in coordination with the military, carry out daily and nightly attacks on Palestinian homes, on businesses, and on mosques, destroying or stealing property and their livestock. In Gaza, which was already cramped to begin with, the Israeli military is pushing folks into a smaller and smaller stretch of land. And despite the ceasefire brokered by Donald Trump last year, Israel continues to bomb and kill displaced Palestinians on a daily basis. This concerted Israeli effort prompted the group of distinguished international global leaders and former heads of state known as the Elders to conclude that Israel is trying to make Palestine disappear, physically, economically, culturally, and politically. Today, we're talking with Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the former chairwoman of the Elders Group. Mary, thank you so much for joining us. Listen, you were just in the West Bank with a number of other members of the Elders, and you recently just saw a lot and put out a report, but I would love to first hear what were your impressions of your visit to the West Bank?
Our impressions were really very serious because I had been there on behalf of the Elders 3 years earlier in July 2023 with my then deputy. I was chair of the Elders at the time with Ban Ki-moon. And we thought at that time that the situation was very bad in the West Bank and unsustainable. But actually going back, and only Helen Clark and myself of the 4 women elders went into West Bank and Israel. We were shocked at how much worse since the 7th of October, those terrible attacks, which the Elders have always condemned. Why I say much worse, it's much more evidently policy now, not individual settler violence as such. It's government policy. It starts with the hate speech and the clear talk about Jewish supremacy and annexation of the West Bank, particularly by Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, ministers of that government. And then you have outposts, which are illegal even under Israeli law. And those outposts, once 3 or 4 people get together in an outpost, they get electricity, they get water, they get roads to and from the outpost, and they get, connivance and protection from the military, from the IDF. So in fact, it's a very different, blatant policy. We were shocked on a visit to a village to see Israeli flags prominently at crossroads on the way in the middle of the West Bank. And then on the one road to the village we were visiting, Israeli flags planted in a very threatening way every few yards on either side of the road. I mean, I've never seen that before. It's just so blatant, so there is no, there's no accountability. It's complete impunity.
Recently, Congressman Ro Khanna also visited the West Bank, said that he was detained, that his staff were harassed, went through I think what he displayed as a shocking experience for him, given his prominence as a U.S. policymaker. But I'm just interested in the fact that this seems to be continuing to go on, even with very prominent statements from other key leaders, that it not happen.
Yes, and actually the fear factor in the West Bank is enormous. We were actually looking at different outposts from a hill, and they were being pointed out to us then, the settlements all over the place. And suddenly we were told, I'm sorry, we have to move. There are settlers approaching. Now, there were only apparently 2 young enough looking settlers actually coming, but the fear was such because of what had happened to others, including that congressperson. So we moved on very rapidly just to avoid an incident. It's indicative of just how serious the situation is. The people in the village were terrified because they had an outpost and close by a military barracks. The military would come into the village regularly. They even threw tear gas into the school at one stage, a schoolboy told us. Women won't go out of the village in their own cars. They have to go collectively by bus if they have to leave the village. Just living in fear because of the kind of overt threat, I would call it now, the overt threat of, at any point, that village too might be torched by the settlers.
In our experience, in our history, in looking at South Africa, and I mention this because Nelson Mandela was the founder of the Elders, and so that is a very vivid image of the tensions in society back then. In that time, they were moving various parts of the black population into Bantustans. Is that the kind of behavior that you're seeing right now in the West Bank?
I'm afraid it is, and it could get so much worse. There's the E1 area where there have been threats to build houses there, settlement houses there, but they've never been implemented. It's always been a hot line. And even when the current Netanyahu government said they were going to open it for tenders, there was a strong reaction globally, and it was put on hold. But it's only on hold, and it could be that even before the election, they will open again for tenders and allow thousands of houses, which would completely split the West Bank, seal off East Jerusalem from Ramallah, for example, and create again this sense of no cohesion on the West Bank and total separation, of course, from Gaza. In other words, no two-state in any realistic sense of a physical two-state.
You name names in the statement that I received by email from the Elders in this, and it's why I very much wanted to talk to you. You name names, and you make a very, very strong statement, and I want to read it for our audience. But you say, from all we've witnessed and heard, our inescapable conclusion is that the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu, and in particular Ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, aim to make Palestine disappear physically, economically, culturally, and politically. How is America responding to what you're putting on the docket?
We did feel it was important to name names. Sometimes the Elders do this. The UN never does this. It's not diplomatically that correct. But if you're talking about truth to power, you have to name names. And actually, it is shocking. If you look at the social media broadcasts of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, hate speech, dehumanizing, and openly claiming that they're going to annex the whole West Bank, openly, and then emboldening the settlers, and then the IDF, the military, being complicit. And a lot of the time they just stand by and do nothing, but sometimes they're actually positively complicit. A number of Palestinians told us, we don't make any distinction anymore between settlers and the military. They're the same. They do the same. And it is as bad as that. It is so much worse than it was in 2023. I thought it was so much worse than the previous time I had been. This time, it's just, it's happening on our watch, and they are trying. And if you look at what's happening in Gaza, the people of Gaza have been pushed to a tiny part of their strip, and a lot of it is Israeli controlled, and there is no real peace in the peace process, because more than 1,000 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed since it started. And they're actually promoting the idea, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, of settlers going back into Gaza. It is very blatant. And unfortunately, President Trump seems, understandably perhaps, very distracted by the other war, his illegal war on Iran that he and Israel did without authority under international law, if I can put it that way.
Are we seeing the complete neutralization and the complete gutting, if you will, of international law and international institutions? I'm interested in whether or not there is a response beyond just finger pointing.
Well, the Elders are very keen to say that international law, even though it's in a difficult position at the moment because of what you've said, nonetheless, it matters greatly. And that was one of the reasons why we went to Brussels, because we wanted the European Union to uphold international law, which recognizes those settlements as contrary to international law. And the International Court of Justice, in its advisory opinion just over 2 years ago, made it clear that there should trade with the occupied territories, with these settlements, should be prevented. Now, a number of European countries, including, I'm happy to say, my own, have passed or are in the process of passing legislation to that effect. But the EU as a whole hasn't done it yet. And our plea to the EU was, this is happening on your watch. For goodness sake, stop trading as a EU with the unoccupied territories, the settlements. And secondly, suspend the trade pillar of the Israeli European Trade Association, because it has an article about human rights, Article 2, which would prevent trade in the breach of human rights, which are being flagrantly breached on a daily basis, on an hourly basis in Gaza and the West Bank.
Did you, when you were visiting the West Bank, meet Palestinian leadership and discuss with them what's going on? You know, where do they turn for protection? Is there any option on the Palestinian side? Are there any other international observers that can be injected from your point of view? Or is it simply like, you know, shooting ducks in a pond?
That precise question we asked, what is the protection for the Palestinian people in their villages with their olive groves, etc.? What's the protection that Palestine, the Palestinian Authority, can give? We met again, we know her, with the foreign minister of Palestine, who's Greek Orthodox herself, a Greek Orthodox Christian. And she told us that, look, if young Palestinian police try to go into something where there's a settlement attack on a village, and they try to stop it, they themselves will be called terrorists, and they'll probably be shot. You know, in other words, and also she pointed out, and this is one of the real problems for the Palestinian Authority, that since the 7th of October, the Israeli government has withheld all of their tax revenue. So they have no money to pay their people. Their people are, operating on much lower salaries or no salaries, and so on. It's very hard for the Palestinian Authority. And then the Board of Peace has decided that there is this technical committee sitting in Cairo that's going to take responsibility for Gaza, which also undermines the holistic nature of the Palestinian Authority for both West Bank and Gaza. So, and in fact, in the village we were in, the clinic there only operates once a month now because of the financial cutbacks, the no tax revenue available to the Palestinian Authority. So from every point of view, they're underfunded. They're much criticized by some of their their own people, because they feel, all they're doing is propping up this awful situation rather than, we did meet wonderful Israeli human rights organizations. We've met them before. We met them this time. B'Tselem, Peace Now, the Prevention Against Torture group, and others. And they're the bravest of the brave, because they are taking cases in the Israeli courts, which Palestinians are not entitled to do, to protect Palestinians at a time when most of the people have really shifted more to the right because of the understandable trauma of the 7th of October. It's really understandable, but if you get bad leadership on top of trauma, it can be very bad for a people.
Well, I just want to put this on the table, that Israel is having elections in October, and one of the questions I have is whether or not we see some of the divides in Israeli society that you may have experienced in some of your discussions with ministers, with others out there, is whether you think Israeli democracy is going to generate possibly an alternative to those you are criticizing now.
Well, we were aware of the discussion around the election, needless to say, and it does seem as though there is a real challenge, and I don't want to get into the politics of it, and that's not what the elders are about, if I could put it that way. But we did meet with President Herzog, we had a robust conversation. He felt that we didn't, we, the elders, and nobody fully understands the trauma of the Israeli people. And he made that point very strongly. And we disagreed on some points, but we began to find common ground. Common ground, for example, of what this, what the conduct, the engagement in the way it is with Gaza and with the West Bank is doing to young IDF women and men. And when they go back into private life, in other words, the higher rate of domestic violence, the higher levels of suicide. There are no public studies about it, but apparently the president is very worried about it because it's a reality in Israel society at the moment. And we also talked about the number of Israeli-Palestinian initiatives that there are. And the elders have been very supportive, for example, of a land for all. The idea that there could be, with the borders of 1967, but that the settlers in the West Bank would become residents of the new Palestinian state and citizens of Israel. And those wanting to return to Israel would become residents of Israel, but citizens of the Palestinian state. And that reminds me a little bit of the fluid identity that arose post the Good Friday Agreement, as we call it, in Northern Ireland, that brought about peace in Northern Ireland. You could be, sort of Irish and British and European at the same time. And, the importance of a British identity in any future All-Ireland situation. That's what we're talking about.
Is there anything from the Irish experience that you think might be valuable for those who want to take a more constructive approach to the crisis there now?
I think there's one particular piece of real wisdom, and that is about decommissioning the arms of the group that have to decommission. That does not happen before a withdrawal of troops or before X, Y, or Z. That happens as part of a process. I think it took over 10 years, maybe as much as 12 years for the full decommissioning of the IRA. And there were very reputable people involved. Now President of South Africa, Ramaphosa, and the former President of Finland, Martti Ahtisaari, when they were out of office, both of them were part of a decommissioning task force. And they talked about the fact that maybe the best decommissioner is rust, because they would look down these drains in Northern Ireland and see the guns rusting in the drains. It's a process, and it must be seen as that. And, the statement that was made under the auspices of the Board of Peace that Hamas was ready to decommission to the new technical coalition, but only if Israel withdrew. This should be part of a process. Israel should begin to withdraw. Hamas should begin to disarm. And in particular, the force that needs to come in to hold the peace needs to come in. The force that has been promised under the Board of Peace, which needs urgently to play its role.
What can we do so that we don't become numb, that we don't make part of what we acquiesce to the kind of trauma that we're seeing today, as you just saw in the West Bank? I'm interested, you clearly put out a statement, but in my mind, the system is ready to run away and continue to turn a blind eye. And I'm interested in what you think the strategies are, given your expertise and the elders, to try and prevent that.
I think it's extraordinarily important that we don't become immune to the terrible suffering of those in Gaza, those in the West Bank, those in East Jerusalem, because there are lots of threats also in East Jerusalem. And there's even a threat to Christians in East Jerusalem, spitting at nuns and priests, for example. And, a whole, again, a completely emboldened kind of getting rid of the other. This is what led to the awful, traumas of the past, and traumas, the wrong word for them. The Holocaust, for example, what happened in Rwanda, the dehumanizing of the other, and then the complicit ignoring of that dehumanizing is really, really very dangerous. It's something we must plead against, fight for, the fact that we must always be on the side of the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people. And there are ways, as we've said, that can come about. And we need innovative thinking. We also, the elders have called for the release of Marwan Barghouti. We met his wife in Amman, all four of us, Grasa, Michelle, Hina Gilani, Helen Clark, and myself. We met with her and her son. We had talked to both of them before by Zoom, and we have called publicly for the release of Marwan Barghouti. He wants a two-state solution. He wants peace. He may stand from prison for election to the president of the Palestinian Authority if that comes about, and to the PLO. But he is somebody that, in particular, Prime Minister Netanyahu does not want to see released, because he knows he would bring the Palestinian people more together and help them to fight for and fight with others to bring about the two-state solution, which is the only peaceful solution. But there are ways of doing it that don't require handover of land now. I mean, so much has there been settlement in the West Bank. We need to think of more imaginative solutions, but they have to be on the basis of two peoples living side by side in peace.
Mary, I think many people are trying to reconcile what they're hearing from you and others about Palestine. I mean, we've seen this all visually in front of our eyes. So to reconcile that with statements that we sometimes hear from other leaders, like President Trump, and he made a statement. It's just completely in a different place. He said, today the Board of Peace reached a historic agreement for the complete disarmament of Hamas and all other armed groups in Gaza. This is a monumental step towards lasting peace and security. This agreement is a critical step towards Gaza finally being governed by a new Palestinian government that will work closely with the Board of Peace to help the Palestinian people, and so on, while your report says that you worry eventually about Israel erasing Palestine physically, economically, culturally, and politically. I just want to know, how do people that are looking at this, listening to this show, reconcile these two very, very different visions?
I think it is confusing for people because they hear the different visions on the media. And very often the media don't want to cover this much. They don't think there's a media audience for it anymore. But actually there is. People still desire justice, and the arc of justice moves slowly, but it moves in the right direction, and it will. The elders always want to bring hope. We do feel there are seeds of hope. There are Palestinians and Israelis who are currently working together. There's even a former prime minister who we spoke to by Zoom, who's part of that Israeli-Palestinian wanting a two-state solution. There are quite a number, and the role of the elders, and it's a modest role, we're humble about it, is to speak truth to power. We only talk about what we see. We saw what was happening. We witnessed it personally. So we're able to say, this is actually what is happening. You can believe it because we have no desire other than for peace for both peoples, for the Israelis and for the Palestinians, side by side, in peace and respect for each other. And hopefully, over time, as happened in Europe with Germany and France, learning, in fact, to build friendship, but peace first. And we hope with all our hearts for that as elders, but we have to speak truth to power.
Well, former President of Ireland and former Chair of the Elders and member of the Elders, Mary Robinson, really appreciate your candor and your insights. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
So what's the bottom line? The Elders was established 20 years ago by Nelson Mandela, and the idea then was to serve as a platform for the global conscience. Their statement on the Israeli government's intention not just to occupy and contain the Palestinians, but actually to erase them, is beyond chilling. In the past, the United States has given unconditional support to Israel while turning a blind eye to its settlement expansion in the West Bank. President Trump has said that he won't allow Israel to annex the West Bank outright, but there's just no pretense of opposing settlement activity, and many Republicans are pushing for the U.S. to call the area by the name preferred by Israel, Judea and Samaria. Palestine is increasingly becoming a wedge issue for both American parties, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. But change comes slowly, definitely not fast enough to prevent more bloodshed and more misery for everyone in the region. And that's the bottom line.